Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel on the occasion of the launch of our new brief on ethnic divisions and ensuring stability in Kazakhstan, a guide for U.S. policy. The Quincy Institute, as most of you know by now, is a think tank based on the idea of restraint in U.S. foreign policy. My name is Suzanne Loftus. I am a research fellow in the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute, and I am the author of this brief. I wrote this brief after a very interesting and fruitful trip to Almaty, Kazakhstan, where I had the honor to interview around 25 people that were working in academia, in journalism, in the media, and also as activists in the region. So it was a very interesting trip, and I came to certain conclusions that I wrote in this brief, and I'm lucky and honored to have two prominent scholars of the region joining me today to also contribute to these themes and to comment on the brief, as well as share any of their own research. With me, I have Nargis Kassenova. She's a senior fellow and director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. She's also an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Regional Studies in Almaty, Kazakhstan, KIMEP University, it's called. I'm also joined by Nurseit Niyazbekov. He is assistant professor in the Department of International Relations at KIMEP as well in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And he also conducts various research and consulting for media and think tanks in the areas of post-communist transitions, democratization, Central Asian state building, and protest mobilization. So I will first present the findings in my brief, and then I'd really like to hear both Nargis and Nurseit's thoughts and comments on the themes, and then we will open it up for discussion. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat as soon as you think of them, and we will get to them after we have the initial discussion. So to start this brief, the idea of this brief is to analyze the potential drivers of ethnic tension and political instability that could ensue in Kazakhstan and address the country's current approach to managing these issues. The brief also concludes with some policy recommendations for the United States towards Kazakhstan. To introduce a little bit, during the Soviet Union, there were certain actions taken by Stalin, for example, mass deportations of Russians and Ukrainians and other ethnic groups to Kazakhstan, as well as Khrushchev's settlement of hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainian farmers as part of his virgin land campaigns to Kazakhstan. So when the country became independent, it found itself in a very multi-ethnic situation. It was highly multi-ethnic, and actually half the population was Russian and the other half was Kazakh. And of course, there were plenty of other ethnic minorities as well that comprised a much smaller percentage. So the country needed to start founding its post-Soviet identity with these factors, taking these factors into consideration. So Kazakhstan's first president, Nurseit Niyazbekov, started his nation-building project, which attempted to bridge the ethnic gap or divisions between all the ethnic groups into a Kazakhstani nation, which was more of a civic conception of Kazakhstan's national identity as opposed to a ethnic Kazakh conception. So Nazarbayev, his legacy, he was actually the first secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan and just continued on to being the president of independent Kazakhstan. And so old power legacies were perpetuated in the country even after independence. But his power and legacy did include a number of positive achievements. As I mentioned, this kind of civic, national unity, nation building attempt to bring the country together, as well as founding this idea of a multi-vector foreign policy for the country, in essence, having a more pragmatic foreign policy towards its major partners and neighbors, which today are Russia, China, and to a lesser extent, the United States. So in all of Kazakhstan's post-Soviet history until today, so far, the country has managed to avoid major ethnic tension. And this is in large part due to those policies I mentioned by the government. While this concept of civic nationalism is what's mostly applied by the government does understand the popularity of ethnic nationalism in the country. But the fact that they're highly influenced by the legacy of Soviet culture, they continue to have this legacy of of fear of ethnic tension and conflict. So they have a dual approach to managing identity issues, balancing the interests of the ethnic nationalist lobbies as well as with this civic form of nationalism. There's also a very interesting demographic trend which has been taking place in the country. So as I mentioned in the beginning, when the country gained independence, it was about half and half in terms of Kazakhs and Russians. But now, actually, due to outmigration by the Russians back to Russia and due to repatriation of Kazakhs, as well as to a much higher birth rate by the Kazakhs, the trend is going towards Kazakhs increasing a lot more in comparison to Russian ethnic minorities. The country is now at about 70% ethnic Kazakhs. And lately, of course, with the war in Ukraine and with the Russian Federation's long-standing claim to protect its ethnic or its Russian citizens abroad or ethnic Russians abroad, and which they use as a major pretext for the invasion of Ukraine, there has been an increasing level of anxiety in Kazakhstan about a potential Russian intervention in the Russian inhabited regions of Kazakhstan, which are mostly in the north, and also there's some in the east and some in the west. But this was one of the major issues and points that I discussed with my interviewees in Almaty when I was there. But while separatist sentiment was prominent in the 1990s when the country first gained independence, today there's actually really no real indication of any organized separatist movement, nor has the Russian government shown any real desire to attack and break up Kazakhstan, despite some rhetoric that you hear here and there. Most of the interviewees said that the risk of inter-ethnic conflict when the country first gained independence was mitigated by the government's approach to language policy, in the sense that it included Russian as an official state language along with Kazakh. Also, political parties based on ethnicity are banned. So those are just ways of, mitigating potential ethnic tension. So the role of the great powers in Kazakhstan, both Russia and China are very involved in the country. They both share, how I phrase it, a great power entente in the region with respect to each other's interests. While Beijing is mostly focused on economic issues, Moscow is mostly focused on security and political matters, and they kind of don't get in each other's way in that sense. Both appear hostile to the idea of more U.S. Involvement in Central Asia, and they're also very, and they care, let's say, a lot about the potential rise of Islamist extremism, and stability is thus an extremely important factor in the region to try to maintain at all costs. They both engage the region through several organizations that they lead. The one on security issues is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they discuss areas of mutual concern, such as terrorism, separatism, or jihadism. China, on its side, is extremely involved through its Belt and Road Initiative in the country. There's 2 out of 6 economic corridors of the BRI passing through Kazakhstan to connect China with Europe, Iran, and Western Asia. So overall, this multi-vector foreign policy has allowed the country to retain cooperative relations with Russia, China, and the US. And it's a positive foreign policy that allows the country to continue to diversify and develop its economy. Most of my interviewee respondents all had positive things to say about it. Right now, the United States has minimal political influence in the country and ranks below China and Russia in terms of trading partners, but it does have significant energy investments in the country. And just an example of how close Russia is to Kazakhstan as opposed to the United States during the important January 22 events in Kazakhstan, which were characterized by a series of violent protests after a steep rise in energy costs. Also, 230 or so people died during this event. The current president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, requested to have the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, of which Kazakhstan is a member, to step in and provide security assistance for the country. So this kind of demonstrates who the preferred partner is in terms, whenever there's some domestic or security situation that arises. And the United States did not get involved in this particular circumstance, and that was probably the right thing to do, as we can see how connected and tied Russian and Kazakh politics are linked, especially after this event, as the CSTO helped to bolster Tokayev's political power. So to get into a little more detail about ethnic divides in Kazakhstan, as mentioned, demographics have changed. Now we're at about 70% ethnic Kazakhs in the country, and that has affected the country's conceptualization of its identity. So there are a lot more Kazakh cultural entrepreneurs, let's call them, who increasingly advance the concept of a Kazakh nation as opposed to the Kazakhstani civic conception I was discussing earlier. And what this would entail is the use of Kazakh in everyday life, which is not the case right now, as Russian is the lingua franca, especially in the major cities. But the idea is to increasingly use Kazakh in society. When it comes to ethnic minorities and how well they're integrated, considering these factors, ethnic Russians perceive themselves to be rather well integrated. However, a lot of the Kazakhs that I spoke to painted a different picture. They, mostly Kazakh nationalists and liberals, also perceived ethnic Russians to be rather unintegrated, refusing to learn the local language and remaining rather enclosed in the Russian media space. Other ethnic minorities, such as the Chinese Muslim minority called Dungens, there has been some instances of ethnic tension, but those I wouldn't really call them to be motivated by ethnic tension per se, but more about land issues or economic issues that then take on a secondary ethnic dimension. The ethnic Uyghurs were reportedly very well integrated. There's had been no reporting of tensions between Kazakhs and Uyghurs. However, there is a strong kind of opposition to China from the Uyghur community because of the human rights violations in Xinjiang. And there's frequent protests outside of the Chinese consulate in Almaty. But because of Kazakhstan's close ties to China, it tries to restrict access to information concerning the atrocities in Xinjiang, just as a way to avoid angering Beijing. So given that background on ethnic tensions, some of the potential drivers of more important political and ethnic turmoil would be, for example, right now, the war in Ukraine has ignited worry among members of the Kazakh elite that Kazakhstan could be next in some of in the Kremlin's, let's say, expansionist agenda, as they categorized it. But if you take an opinion poll of the entire country, I'm not so sure how reliable those are, but the ones that do exist say that most disagree that a Russian invasion is a likely scenario. A lot of the interviewee respondents also shared similar perceptions. But of course, this could change if, let's say, the government were to increase ethnic nationalist policies or fail to address these economic grievances I mentioned that could eventually turn into a political and ethnic disturbance. This could trigger protests or become something unstable and maybe incite some Kremlin intervention. But so far, Kazakhstan has remained neutral when it comes to Russian to the votes on the war in Russia, the war in Ukraine by Russia at the United Nations. It's part of their pragmatic foreign policy, let's say, to remain neutral so that they can preserve this positive relationship with their neighbor, because of how close Russia is to them and their level of dependence on Russia. But we have some Russians evading the draft. As many as maybe 70,000 or more have now received Kazakh IDs and wish to stay long term. And this has upset the balance of jobs and apartment prices in some of the regions where they've settled, which could potentially risk ethnic tension or political tension in those regions. And given this this development, the government actually has put forward a legislation to require a solid foundation of the Kazakh language, and just for as a requirement for obtaining this Kazakh citizenship. So maybe, these could also be potentially areas of tension between Russians and Kazakhs if there's anti-Russian sentiment that arises because of the new arrivals. Other drivers of conflict could include just the general demographic changes that I mentioned and how fast the government is pursuing this Kazakhization policy in the country, which, as mentioned, is an attempt to increase the use of Kazakh as opposed to Russian throughout the country, and also just to, it makes sense, of course, that this would be what they're doing. It's just that if these efforts are maybe happening too fast, maybe there would be some political dissent because of that. So these efforts include, for example, increasing the number of schools in the Kazakh language, and they've been successful so far. More people are speaking Kazakh, and they're not kind of, this de-Russification idea is not happening at all, because people are still speaking Russian. It's just that now they're also speaking more Kazakh. So if this were to happen on a much faster scale, perhaps we'd see some tension, but so far it's not really happening, especially not outwardly politically. It happens maybe on social media where there's arguments about such issues. Another potential area of conflict could be, let's say, if there's a change in leadership in the country, if this kind of Soviet communist legacy party be replaced by a more ethno-nationalist leader, then this idea of a Kazakh nation will be very dominant and will replace the civic idea of nationalism in the country, which may incite some instability as well. But the thing is that because, as I mentioned, these demographic changes are showing that the Russian population will continue to shrink, with time, these issues won't be a problem, because with time, the Russian minority will be so small that, it won't cause as much political tension as it would now, as they have maybe about 20% of Russian ethnic composition right now. Other than these areas, some other areas of potential instability include perhaps within the Uyghur community, if the government, for example, lifts its current controls over the free flow of information on Chinese repression in Xinjiang, and lifts its limits on political protests, this could cause some tension with China, for example. This could lead to instability. Or let's say if a more ethno-nationalist leader became the next president of Kazakhstan, maybe he'd start placing more emphasis on the repression of Uyghurs and Kazakhs in Xinjiang. This could also potentially lead to some instability with the current balancing act that the country has with China and Russia. Another potential source of instability could be rising Islamic extremism, which is so far not a problem. The role of extremism and radicalism is very limited and discouraged by the state. However, I did speak to some scholars, some extremism scholars, who have mentioned that extremism is rising and is manifesting internally across ethnic and religious lines. And the US Department of State has also mentioned that there's an increase in extremism and terrorism-related prosecutions in the country. And if there were any rise in extremism or terrorism-related incidents, of course, you'd see an increased role for Russia and China in the region, or in the country specifically, as they're very concerned about terrorism-related instability. So if given all that information, a few recommendations for the United States with Kazakhstan, of course, understanding that I am writing this brief on behalf of the Quincy Institute, we strongly believe in the idea of restraint in US foreign policy. So a lot of the advice is along those lines. So although the current internal situation in Kazakhstan is stable, reasonably stable, the trends that I highlighted or some of the potential areas of instability could change that stability in the future. And the advice to the United States is just to maintain its current policy of being rather balanced towards the country, focusing mainly on economic ties, staying out of political and security issues, refraining from getting involved in major political turmoil, such as in January 2022, when it did decide to remain uninvolved. Because US involvement would really only place the country in a vulnerable position vis-a-vis its neighbors, and would incite some security tension, again, with Russia or with China, which is, essentially putting the United States into a crisis in an area where it actually doesn't possess too many major strategic interests in the first place. But it should nevertheless increase, actually, its economic investments, increase trade with the country, diplomatic ties, just to help Kazakhstan develop as a nation. And American businesses should be encouraged to compete in the country, just not to the extent that it creates some type of zero-sum competition with China and Russia. And when it comes to democracy promotion, there really isn't a lot of appetite for liberal values in the country, as I've understood from my interviews, but also from opinion polls that were taken nationally. So US efforts to promote democratization would probably not get very far. And, of course, because of the country's institutional legacy and history, any political reforms will probably be rather slow in the country. And there are certain power structures, as I mentioned, that will most likely remain in place. And though they've been undemocratic for the most part, they've really been a stable, factor and component to keeping that stability, as we talked about. So the US should really just try to focus on mechanisms like US aid or similar development organizations. Kazakhstan will need support, especially because of its demographic changes, in areas such as housing, education, healthcare, transport, and just the increasing pressures of urbanization and population growth. The US is also involved in what's called the C5+1 initiative in Central Asia. This is a diplomatic arrangement between the United States and the Central Asian nations, which, even though it's been criticized for not doing much, this is an important sign, or signal that the United States is interested in the region. And this should be even more utilized, and projects should be encouraged through this platform to work together with Central Asian nations for the development of that region. So, the United States should understand that, of course, in terms of voting at the United Nations and such issues like that, of course, Kazakhstan will rather remain neutral and not vote when it comes to issues that concern Russia or China, because, they're right there and they're the country's biggest partners. So it kind of just makes sense. So to kind of conclude and wrap up these initial thoughts, yes, maybe, rising nationalism, ethnic nationalism could pose a challenge in the country or with Kazakh-Russian relations, but so far it has not. And this is largely thanks to the multi-vector foreign policy of the nation, and also the civic conception of a Kazakhstani nation that have binded ethnicities together, at least rhetorically. And it would probably be in the interest of the country to continue applying such policies for the near future, just to maintain that internal and external stability. Because, as we mentioned, these demographic changes, the country can afford to move slowly and cautiously in these areas towards identity-related reforms. Naturally, these trends will strengthen Kazakh political and cultural dominance anyway. And the US should continue pursuing its balanced policy towards the country and keep it that way. So thank you so much for your attention on this initial presentation of my brief. I really look forward to Nargis and Nurseit's comments and further discussion. Thank you. Maybe Nargis, you want to go first?
Okay, I will do that. So first, I want to say that I'm very grateful to you, Suzanne, and to the Quincy Institute for paying attention to Kazakhstan and the region of Central Asia. That's not the most popular object of study in general, and for doing this research and doing the field trip and writing this brief tackling very difficult and sensitive issues and generating a new discussion. So I will first talk a little bit about the first part. If I take a cue from the title of your paper, ethnic divisions and ensuring stability in Kazakhstan, a guide for U.S. policy. First, I'll talk about the ethnic divisions and ensuring stability, and then I will make some remarks about U.S. policy toward the region. So on ethnic divisions, of course, Kazakhstan is a multi-ethnic state with a large Russian minority, and it is undergoing processes of nation-state building, and therefore ethnic divisions they are an important factor and potentially destabilizing factor. The cases of interethnic clashes, as you noted in your brief, have shown that that corruption, weak governance, weak rule of law, they do create certain conditions for this sort of outbreaks. And as you also rightly pointed out, ethnic divisions could be particularly dangerous if manipulated by Russia and used as a lever or a pretext for interference or for invasion. And you noted that that we're getting some signals from Russia, some bad signals from Russia, and they are worrying for Kazakhs, but they're also worrying, I would say, for Kazakhstani Russians who don't want to be framed as a potential fifth column in the country. And I think it's worth noting that Russia's war against the Ukraine is catalyzing nation-building processes in Kazakhstan. The popularity of Kazakh language is up substantially, I would say, and we see Russian-speaking citizens, and these are not only ethnic Russians, but also ethnic Kazakhs, etc. Representatives of other minorities are actively enthusiastically learning the language. Because speaking, I would say speaking Kazakh now is not only an ethnic marker, but also a marker of your citizenship and solidarity, loyalty to the country, and being part of the camp that is against imperial aggression. And those who follow social media, for example, probably saw some really nice artistic projects with the Kazakh musicians and Ukrainian musicians singing together in Kazakh and Ukrainian. There's some really nice art projects. So there is this flourishing of kind of the solidarity. And you noted in the paper the decolonization processes. Many people don't feel comfortable in this kind of talking in these terms, but in substance, I think that's what these are the processes in substance that the war has accelerated, I would say, in Kazakhstan. But ethnic divisions, these are not the only divisions in the country that can create instability. And there is substantial socioeconomic polarization in the country. We saw how socioeconomic grievances and discontents accompanied by being sick and tired of the Nazarbayev regime, they fueled protests in January 2022. And here I want to stress an important fact that these protests and violence in January, they were not accompanied by interethnic clashes or or nationalist slogans. The main slogan was "Shalket," the old men go, and people were gathering under Kazakhstan's flag and singing the anthem and all that. Does it mean that there is no potential for some political entrepreneurs, using these grievances and channeling them into the nationalist and anti-minorities direction? There is such potential, and we see this kind of politics, this kind of populism in many places, including developed democracies. So unfortunately, there is a possibility, but it's not inevitable, and I hope that by 2030, when Tokayev's term ends, the global tide will change as well, and will be less conducive to this kind of politics. We'll see. In the meantime, what I think we see in the meantime is the normalization of the state. Kazakh language is the state language, and it needs to function as such. But as I think you rightly point out, the pace is important, and slow and careful is better. And here, I think President Tokayev would agree with you, and that these are the kind of messages that he has been sending. For example, when Latinization of the alphabet was discussed, he was saying, "Oh, we shouldn't hurry too much. It's a very important issue. It should be done very carefully, without rush. It should be a proper transition, since the language is the soul of the nation." Now, on the U.S. policy, I wasn't sure what you mean saying in the brief that the U.S. must resist the temptation to become involved in Kazakhstan's internal politics. I don't know what you mean by such involvement. And also, if you could elaborate on the temptation, do we see this kind of temptation? That would be great. I think aiding Kazakhstan in its attempt at political and economic reforms, what you write in the recommendations, without expecting or demanding rapid change, it has been a staple of the U.S. approach toward Kazakhstan very much since the beginning. Well, I'm also not sure that I fully agree. Actually, I don't fully agree with what you said on the economic relations having been a priority. Of course, Kazakhstan has oil. Of course, Chevron is in, and all that. But Kazakhstan is not Saudi Arabia, and even in Saudi Arabia's case, it's a set of interests. It's not just economy. It's not just oil. There is a set of interests that drives the U.S. policy toward Kazakhstan, and these are political, security, economic interests. You also write in the recommendation that the U.S. should refrain from any efforts to sway Kazakhstan to ally itself with the West. I partially agree. And I think the U.S. State Department officials would also agree that it's counterproductive to push Kazakhstan too much to stand up to Russia and China, or China on issues. As you note you noted in your brief, Secretary Pompeo's remarks that he made while on a visit in Kazakhstan. So these remarks didn't create anything but unease in Kazakhstan and in the region. So it's impossible. I think it's clear that it's impossible to detach Kazakhstan fully from Russia and China, politically, economically, security-wise. But here we can also mention that the U.S. itself is still in the process of detaching itself from Russia, Russian metals, Russian uranium, and not speaking of decoupling from China, right? So these are very important neighbors of ours. We cannot move out, so you need to kind of find a way to deal with them. I would also advocate for a stronger push at this important point when meaningful change, I think, is possible, and at the same time big troubles are possible too. So here I would kind of align with you. I think that the kind of more attention would be really good, and a stronger approach would be really good. Maybe I'll push a little bit against what you said about the demand for democratization, for liberalization, and I think, of course, it's important not to overestimate, but it's what this demand is. But it's important not to underestimate either. Of course, the society is not on the cusp of, like a velvet revolution, right? And in certain kind of strata groups of the society, the social conservatism is on the rise, and often it's linked to Islamization of the society. Then the Russian propaganda does its bit as well. Then the kind of of course, this destabilizing potential of democratization is kind of, also on display. So there is that. I agree, but at the same time, there is demand for change, and we saw this demand with the protests, and these are not the first protests. We've had, of course, small scale, but protests have been, kind of regular in Kazakhstan. And Nurseit can say more, because that's his actually he has been doing research on protests, and the government talks about political reforms, right? You are critical of the political reforms that have been carried out by President Tokayev, but we can of course discuss that, how good these reforms are, but they talk nonstop about the need for reforms, because they know that that's what the kind of people want to hear, right? And that's what people expect, right? So they don't talk just about stability. Let's not completely let's not do anything big. And I want to add two little things here. One has to do with extremism. I think we need to be very kind of careful how we use the word extremism, because, we all know how authoritarian governments use the word in a very kind of broad sense, and a dissent can be defined as extremism, right? So what is extremism, right? And also on the Uyghur issue, and you said that these are Uyghurs who kind of have these anti-Chinese feelings, and kind of they are active on the issue of the re-education camps in Xinjiang. I would say that these are actually Kazakhs who are at the forefront. We did see some Uyghur activism in the early 90s, but there was a crackdown on Uyghur activism pretty much right away, and that's when Kazakhstan was establishing relations with China, and he was going along with this agenda of fighting the three evils. And so I would say the Uyghur community now is quite apolitical, and these Kazakh networks, and it's the Kazakh organization led by Serikjan Belash, right? That was kind of the strongest, and there was organizing protests, and and doing advocacy on the issue. So, okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nargis. That was very insightful. I'll take Nurseit's comments and then respond afterwards. Nurseit, please.
Thank you very much for having me, Suzanne. Nice to see you, Nargis, and greetings to the audience. So I'll be very short to leave some room for Q&A. But there are three major points I'd like to make. First, in regards to the ethnic issues, ethnic divisions. I think that the war in Ukraine has become a natural experiment for the Kazakhstan's, national identity construction, for the Kazakhstan's nation-building efforts. And what has often been described as extremely vague, extremely abstract, I'm talking about the national ideology, has in fact showed to be pretty much solid. And the popularization of Kazakh language, the rise of demand for people to learn Kazakh, even among those Russians who are arriving to Kazakhstan, the popularity of some Kazakh, popular brands like, fashion brands like Kazakh Republic kind of things, right? And there is even a rise of Kazakh language courses. So all of this depicts that the public opinion is sort of very strongly crystallizing around Tokayev's rhetoric, and Tokayev's rule, Tokayev's image is becoming a sign of national unity. And there are many people who admire what Tokayev is doing. I'm talking about the general mass. I'm not talking about the active citizens, the activists. So in that sense, the war in Ukraine, even among the Russians who live in Kazakhstan, has received certain criticism of Putin, and there are ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan condemning Putin and addressing to the Russian members of the parliament, saying we don't need to be liberated, we don't need to be rescued. All of this suggests that even the Russian minority in Kazakhstan is in support of the Kazakh national identity, one which is based on this civicness, on the civic identity instead of ethnic identity. So there are more and more Russians saying that, yeah, we are Kazakhs, essentially. And there are also Koreans, Ukrainians, and a bunch of other Uzbeks who are all both hands supporting the idea of Kazakhstani identity. So that's my first point. The second point regarding the US involvement in the Kazakhstani domestic affairs, I would say that US should continue its balanced approach. This is what, Suzanne, I think you've written in your policy brief. By balanced, I mean the West in general should continue its developmental approach to democracy promotion and assistance, instead of direct engagement of assisting the opposition political parties, something they've been doing in the 90s. They should be following what the European governments are doing in their neighborhood approach, neighborhood strategy for Central Asia, which is supporting civil society organizations indirectly, providing economic support, providing some sorts of diplomatic support, without directly criticizing the government for mishandling certain political prisoners, for directly reprimanding them for carrying out falsified elections. So they should be playing very carefully. And why, if you ask me why, because I think that the whole world is watching more closely to what's happening in Russia, especially in the background of the recent attempted coup, events in Russia. So if if Putin's rule is becoming weaker and weaker, if Russia all of a sudden is completely and unanimously regarded to be losing in this war. In that case, Kazakhstan would be revisiting its multi-vectored foreign policy, and this is where it would seek support of China, of course, and the West. So by revisiting its foreign ties, I think the Western diplomatic support, political support, would really help Kazakhstan in case Russia is losing, in case relations with Russia are weakening and Kazakhstan has more leverage for diplomatic and foreign policy maneuvering. So the West, in that case, should keep a close eye at what's happening in Kazakhstan, especially in its foreign policy department. And finally, regarding in general, the political situation in Kazakhstan, is Kazakhstan anywhere close to liberalizing? Is it anywhere close to becoming a democracy? I wouldn't say so. And this is what the West should also be very realistic about. Kazakhstan is not moving in the direction of Western liberal democracy. It is, in fact, only upgrading itself as a consolidated authoritarian regime. And after all, I would even say that more and more people in Kazakhstan are accepting this sort of political regime. With the rise of conservatism that Nargis mentioned, I think that people don't really want to be, a Western democracy style political regime. So as long as Tokayev is smart, as long as his domestic and foreign policies are aligned with the expectations of the general mass, including the civic population, the civic-minded, I think people will adopt and will accept whatever political regime and political ideology we have. And from what we are observing right now, with the popularity of Tokayev, with the popular support of Kazakhstan's foreign policy, and including the domestic policy, I would say that there is a larger support for this enlightened form of authoritarianism instead of, democracy. And that's why also I'm making reference to the second point I made. The West shouldn't be pushing its idea, its version of democracy, because Kazakhstan, unlike any other Central Asian country, is not fit for the Western style of democracy. It's going to be anything in between Western form of democracy and steppe, sultanistic, paternalistic type of political regime. This is all for me. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Nurseit. That was very enlightening as well. Just to address a couple of things that Nargis had asked me before we open it up to questions. When I talk about resisting temptation, I suppose it is well worth clearing up. It's given the circumstances of today's geopolitical situation, whereas we see rising tensions between the West and the East, this word temptation is, the US has this tendency to try to sway others, to be more on its side in its confrontational relationship with, let's say, Russia or China. And in that sentence, I was trying to suggest that perhaps the US should stay reasonably balanced the way it already is. Like, its policy towards the country is very reasonable and acceptable. And when I meant economic relations, of course, I wasn't just referring to oil. I mean, of course, Kazakhstan has a lot more to offer than that. It's more helping the country develop. So creating alternative trade partners, helping it create alternative trade routes for energy, but also, US aid in support of, its development needs, its demographic changes. So more economic support and investment in the country's companies and, emerging businesses also was what I was hoping to convey through that. So yeah, both of your remarks were excellent. I see we have a few questions here, not too many. Kazakhstan is not a country that everyone knows a lot about. So I'm really glad that we at least had this level of participation. So let's see at some of these questions here. Actually, in my brief, I do discuss a lot this idea of whether, Kazakhstan could potentially be next in the Kremlin's agenda. So it would be interesting to hear if Nargis and Nurseit agree with the way I answered that question. That seems to be a popular question in the chat. What do the two of you think about potential Kremlin intervention? Nargis, please.
I think it's very unlikely. I don't see what benefits they would get from it, but there will be kind of a lot of losses if they do that. But the regime now is destructive and so self-destructive, right? That some kinds of trouble they can create, maybe not the full-fledged invasion. I think it's highly unlikely. But Russia creating problems for Kazakhstan, that's can be. I don't know what Nurseit would think about it.
I agree with Nargis. It's highly unlikely. Otherwise, it would be, a total suicide for both of the states and for geopolitics in the region overall. But there are certain risks. There are many variables, and one of the variables is exactly, the U.S. engagement in the region, right? If the U.S. is too actively involved, right, instead of pursuing a balanced approach, if it is too actively involved in promoting its agenda in the already existing environment, very irritating, very sensitive environment, then that could definitely backfire. In addition to that, Tokayev's foreign policy could trigger that. The civic activists within the country, there are a bunch of agent provocators, in the region, in Kazakhstan itself, who could also cause certain issues. And Putin himself, his narcissistic inclinations could also make it happen. So there are these variables, but in the current layout, it is highly unlikely.
Okay, great. And actually, there's a question directly for Nurseit, so I'll go ahead and ask that to you. The last point that you made in your debrief there was very interesting for the audience. The question is, how do you see the succession happening from the current head of Kazakhstan to the next one?
Authoritarian leaders are very cunning, very smart. Every single technique of doing that has already been depicted and has already been experienced in the international history of authoritarianisms. So, being realistic, in the next elections, will Tokayev reappoint himself or not? Though he promised that he would not do it. Even if he doesn't do it, he will find someone. There are, trust me, plenty of wannabes, who would like to success, Tokayev. So I wouldn't be extremely surprised if there is a new person, and if the new person will radically redraft the future of Kazakhstani political trajectory. So I wouldn't be very optimistic in that sense. Status quo, in other words.
I would put my money on him not going for the next term. I think he would,
find someone else.
Yeah, in 2020. But I think now there is a kind of a trial period that like different people will be tried in important positions, to see who is the most capable, and so I think it'll be. It will be interesting to watch.
Indeed. So part of the brief also discussed how these ethnic potential drivers of ethnic tension could be due to more economic issues as opposed to actually ethnic divides or ethnic, turmoil. And so one of the questions is about actually the economy in Kazakhstan. There's the western part of the country is very oil rich. However, it's the poorest region of the country. So this is important also in the sense that how is the government addressing such issues? And, you know, how do you see this developing in the future, and would it potentially cause further protests like these? Basically, the 2022 protests started in that region because of rising oil prices. So how is the government going to address this in the future?
Should I? Since the Zhanaozen events in 2011, and also even in the Soviet times, in the 1989, there were also confrontations, and plus the 2022 January events, they all demonstrate indeed that there is a major inequality, economic inequality in Kazakhstan. And Nazarbayev and Tokayev, their governments have been doing what they could in order to improve the living conditions there. But there are still issues with drinking water, issues with the roads, with electricity, with many basic things. And so they are trying to do what they can, but it's not enough. It's not enough. And the region is still very unstable. So I would expect even more outbreaks of dissent exactly emanating from the Western Kazakhstan.
I would slightly disagree with Nurseit in a sense. I don't think they did what they could. You know, much more could have been done, and the riches, you know, have been pilfered. Right, the kind of Kazakhstan is so rich, it's so resource rich, and you know, if you calculate, you know, all the money received for selling all the, you know, all the things that we were selling, you know, and with the small population we have, we should have been, you know, we should have been living much better. So definitely not enough was done, not kind of, and too much was pilfered. But I think that the kind of the Tokayev administration, Tokayev team they're much more aware of this, of the problem, and social justice and kind of the changing relations between the center and the regions. These are central now for the agenda. Maybe the implementation is not very good, right? And but definitely there is an awareness, and of course the protest of 2022 helped, you know, to kind of really drive it home. So hopefully more will be done. I think there is a lot more attention now to the regions, to what's happening in the regions, and that's a good development. Before it was like, you know, everything was going to Astana, right? Now I think it's changing, which is good.
Excellent. Well, I just want to thank both of you again for being here and for participating, and I really appreciated your remarks. And also to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again in the near future.